Morning, everyone. Welcome to today's web briefing, The State of New Jersey's Nonprofit Community. I'm Linda Czipo, President and CEO of the Center for Nonprofits, and I'm very excited to present today's session. Joining me behind the curtain is Debbie Duncan, Director of Member Services here at the Center, and you'll be hearing momentarily from Sally Glick of Sobel & Company, the supporters of this year's survey. We have a lot to cover today, and we'll be going through the information fairly quickly, but we are recording today's web briefing, and you'll receive a link to the recording along with the slides and any other follow-up information via email. If you have any questions or technical difficulties, please enter your question into the chat box. Feel free to ask any substantive questions at any time. And if we don't answer the question during the presentation, we'll answer it afterward if time permits, and if we can't get to it at all, we'll follow up separately. Center for Nonprofits is New Jersey's state association for the nonprofit community. For close to 35 years, the center has existed to strengthen New Jersey's nonprofits individually and collectively in order to improve the quality of life for the people of our state. If your organization is a member of the center, we thank you for your support and involvement as we pursue this work together. If you're not a member, we invite you to join us and experience firsthand how membership works for you. Before we begin, I want to call your attention to some terrific upcoming webinars and events. Two of them are occurring this week, so you might want to take a look at that very, very carefully. First is the Happy Healthy Nonprofit tomorrow at 3:30, and the second, also related to stress management, is presented by our chairperson, and it's entitled "Put Your Life Vest On First, the Impact of Stress for Nonprofits." There are other upcoming webinars listed on the screen, as well as many more that you could take a look at in our upcoming events page. Would also encourage you to save the date for our annual New Jersey Nonprofit Conference. It will take place December 6th in Somerset. It's a don't miss opportunity for inspiration, learning, networking with 500 nonprofit colleagues and champions, so we hope we will see you there. I'd like to thank Sally Glick and Sobel & Company, LLC, Certified Public Accountants and Consultants, for generously supporting this year's survey. Sally is the Principal and Chief Growth Strategist at Sobel, and she's a board member at the Center for Nonprofits, and I'd like to invite her to say a few words before we begin. Sally?
Great. Good morning. Thank you so much, Linda. My ego is thrilled to see my name in big lights, but the reality is here, of course, is that it's Sobel & Company, and particularly Ron Natan and Bridget Hartnett and our entire nonprofit practice group that really drives all of this. We're committed to the community. I'm a board member, as you said, Linda, for the Center for Nonprofits, and I fully appreciate everything that you do for all of the nonprofits in New Jersey. But when you asked us last year, and again this year, about the survey, we were thrilled to do it because we've typically conducted our own, and it's so much more meaningful for us to be partnering with you than to trying to go it alone. The trends, the outcomes, the insights that you're going to share with us all today are incredibly meaningful, and we're just thrilled to really be a part of it. And I'm thrilled to be at a firm that is so completely committed to helping those who are most vulnerable in our state, and that's the nonprofit community. So we're delighted to be here and to be your partners.
Thank you so much, Sally. Thanks to you and everybody at Sobel for supporting not only the center and the 2017 survey, but also what you do for the nonprofit community. This is a very special firm, and we are thrilled to be associated with you. Okay, so let's get started. What are we going to cover today? I'm going to start off with an overview of the New Jersey nonprofit community. We will then dive into the highlights of the findings from this year's survey. We'll talk a little bit about what this means, because obviously that's what matters the most, and what can we do about this? What are the implications of the information that we've been gathering, that nonprofits are telling us they're experiencing, and what does this mean for us going ahead? And certainly this is not the end of the conversation, this is just the beginning, and it's part of an ongoing discussion that we all need to have. Just by point of clarification, when we talk about the nonprofit community for purposes of this survey, we are pretty much talking about the 501c3 nonprofit community, the charitable, religious, education kinds of organizations that provide a whole array of services that make our lives better. Anything from disaster relief and response to public radio to essential human services, philanthropy, and everything in between. The nonprofit community, of course, is very, very diverse, and it touches every aspect of our lives. Equally important, though, is the economic effect and the economic significance of the nonprofit community. Many of you already know there are 30,000 plus 501c3 organizations in New Jersey. They employ 314,000 people, or almost 10% of the state's workforce, more than in many major industries. Some of those resources and employees are concentrated in certain subsectors of the nonprofit community, but clearly from a collective perspective, the impact is very significant. Nonprofits collectively spend $38 billion every year, much of it within the Garden State, and we channel the resources of volunteers, 1.5 million plus, who provide services that are valued over $5 billion every year. So there's an economic component of this that's very, very important to keep in mind when we're talking about the well-being of the nonprofit community, the impact of the nonprofit community on New Jersey, and this is a message that we always want to make sure that our policymakers, our business leaders, the public, the media understands, just as importantly as the vital services themselves that nonprofits provide. The survey itself, the center has surveyed the nonprofit community at least annually since 2001. This is our way of taking a pulse about the nonprofit community, how are trends, what kinds of trends there are with respect to funding, with respect to programs, the issues that nonprofits are identifying as being the most important, how are nonprofits adjusting what they're doing, all sorts of related kinds of questions. This year's survey was conducted, the data was collected in March, and we received 301 responses, so the data that you will see are based on those 301 responses from nonprofits. So what are we seeing? We are seeing, and this is probably a familiar refrain, a growing demand for nonprofit services. This is not a new phenomenon, and this year it was no different. In national surveys conducted by the Nonprofit Finance Fund, as well as in the center's surveys, it's pretty consistent. 75 to 80% of respondents typically say that demand for their services has been going up. In this year's Center for Nonprofits survey, it was 75% that said the demand had gone up in the last year, and an equivalent percentage, 76%, said that they predicted that demand was going to continue to rise in the upcoming year. In the Nonprofit Finance Fund surveys, the most recent of which was in 2015, they found that over half of their respondents said they couldn't meet the increased demand. We ask a slightly different question in terms of, okay, if your demand was rising, were you also able to serve more people or patrons or clients or whatever your constituency is? And in our surveys as well, there is a gap. Depending on the subsector and the industry, it was at least 10 points, meaning around 65% said that they served more people in the past year. And in some subsectors, human services, public and societal benefit, and health, to name three, though that gap was even more acute. So the implications are important here. It's important to keep in mind demand is going up, and we need to be concerned about whether organizations are able to meet that increased demand. The resources needed to meet demands are not keeping pace, and that's also a significant finding that we have experienced over the last several years. This is not new either. This graph represents the different changes that organizations reported in funding from a variety of common sources. The farther to the right the combined bar goes, the more nonprofits reported receiving funding from that source. The darkest bars indicate whether an organization received, or our respondents received, increased funds from that source. The orange bars in the middle are decreases, and the pinkish bars were no significant change. So in most sources, no significant change tended to outweigh increases and decreases. The good news is, for many sources, decreases were reported by least, but what you're talking about here in terms of private foundations, for example, the bar on the top, by far more respondents reported kind of flat funding or decreases than reported increases. Our respondents had the best experience over the past year from donations from individuals and special events, where increased funding outweighed the decreases, certainly, and they also outweighed flat funding. In a more aggregate sense, here's part of the issue. 40% of our survey respondents reported that their funding overall had increased during the past fiscal year, but 51% reported that their expenses had increased in the same period. About 2/3 of our respondents predicted that expenses would continue to rise in 2017, but only half of those respondents predicted that their overall funding would increase. So again, we've got this situation where 3/4 of our respondents say demand is going up. 2/3 of them are saying expenses are going up, but only half of them are saying that their overall funding is going up. And again, to keep this in mind with respect to the capacity of nonprofits to meet the demands and the roles that are expected of them, this is a very important disconnect. We asked organizations about the top issues affecting their individual organizations, and we asked them about the top issues affecting the nonprofit sector viability over the coming decade. This is a question that we've asked pretty consistently over the years since we've been doing this survey. And we do provide a laundry list of rather specific choices, and these are the issues that rise to the top. And a lot of these are pretty consistent as well. In terms of viability of individual organizations, it's not terribly surprising. Financial uncertainty is the top of the list, mentioned among the top 5 by almost 60% of our respondents. A lot of the concerns have to do with capacity building and sustainability. So they're expressing the need for better branding, better communications. A lot of them are saying the need for a stronger board. They talk about not being able to afford the staff that they need to provide the services. And they talk about costs of maintaining those staff in terms of benefits and insurance and whatnot. And of course, the increased demand for program services is also weighing heavily on our respondents' minds. In terms of what our respondents felt were the biggest issues with respect to the nonprofit community overall, the top vote getter was foundation and corporate funding. Again, in terms of the stability or the unpredictability of funding sources, it wasn't just foundation and corporate funding, but that certainly was the one mentioned the most frequently. The need for nonprofit infrastructure and capacity building to shore up the systems for nonprofits. Again, boards, the need to attract and retain capable and committed board members. It's always among the top 3. This particular year it was tied for second. Also weighing heavily on the minds of our respondents, federal funding and federal budget issues, named by almost 40 people. 40% of our respondents. Again, the workforce and the ability to attract and retain good qualified workers, and certainly state fiscal policy and state budget issues. All of these were mentioned fairly frequently. I should mention, in terms of the timing of this year's survey, again, we collected responses in mid-March, which meant that it was administered after the governor's proposed budget was released, and the president's federal proposed budget brief was released during the response period. So that may have had an impact on what some people said. Aside from those issues, being able to choose from the list, we ask people what other kinds of trends they're experiencing. What other kinds of issues do they want to make us aware of? And these are some of the ones that rose to the top. This is an open-ended question, so people were able to write in whatever they wanted. It's not terribly surprising that a lot of people are expressing uncertainty about the impact of proposed budgets, government budgets on the federal and state level in particular, but also beyond on county and local. But the impact of proposed budget cuts on the ability of nonprofits to provide the programs that communities need was expressed by a number of people. The need to, again, support nonprofit infrastructure, make sure that nonprofit systems, including overhead and direct costs, are funded adequately. This was mentioned by several respondents. Government contracts and the needless complexity of the contracting system, and the fact that government contracts don't cover the cost of providing services in many instances was something that was mentioned by a number of respondents. Some other things that came up in this segment of the questionnaire, there were some people who expressed concern about federal proposals to weaken the existing ban on partisan political activity by 501c3 organizations. You may also know that as the Johnson Amendment, which has been getting quite a bit of press lately from the center and a lot of advocates nationally. Also concerns about what happens in the upcoming tax reform efforts, what's going to happen to charitable giving incentives, what's going to happen in other circles with respect to tax reform. Organizations for themselves have been talking about the need to diversify their own funding, and certainly leadership transitions and the ability to adapt to the changing environment are certainly other trends that organizations articulated specifically. So what are they doing? What are organizations doing about all this? They're doing a number of things that you might expect. Most commonly, of course, they're looking for new and alternative revenue sources to shore up their strength and to perhaps make up for sources that may be going away or that may be decreasing or have not kept pace with the increased demand. They're trying to do what they can to increase other resources. Volunteer recruitment is on the rise. They're growing their own advocacy efforts, both in respect to public policy as well as advocacy for the funding for their own particular circumstance. Collaboration is a hallmark of the nonprofit community, and at least 40 to 50% every year of our respondents say that they have launched new collaborations or continued old ones, and that is the case this year as well. A number of program adjustments to reflect changes in constituency. Some organizations are trying to be more responsive to the diversity of the clients that they're serving. More special events. This is not something that funders necessarily want to hear, but since organizations have been making out comparatively better in terms of special events, there are some organizations that are holding more of them or entertaining them when they haven't been before. And certainly shared services is another adjustment that organizations have made. Again, not necessarily new, but there's a renewed attention to it. I will say in this year's survey, mergers were not mentioned as frequently as perhaps in some other years, although they are still part of the discussion. It is possible that that will be on the table again, depending on what happens with the funding climate and the economy and its effect on organizations' viability. We also ask organizations, overall, how are you doing? Are your circumstances better, worse, or no different than they were a year ago? This particular slide presents the results for the last 10 years. And the reason we go back the reason I decided to go back that far is because the end of 2008, 2009, of course, was the worst of the economic downturn, the financial collapse, and it had a pretty devastating effect on the nonprofit community. What we have found is that the recovery in New Jersey for nonprofits has taken quite a while. So having that trend data going back 10 years we felt would be pretty illustrative. So if you look at, for example, 2009, 2010, we had fully a third of our respondents who said things were worse than they had been before, compared to 2008, before the collapse, when it was only 15%. We have a little bit of spiking. Things had gotten gradually better in 2014, 2015, and what we see over the last couple of years is that things are taking a little bit of a backslide. We have, again, about a third of our respondents, a little bit more, saying that things are not any different than they were the year before, but fewer respondents in 2016 or 2017 were willing to say that things were overall were better than they had been. And looking ahead, we asked people, what do you think for the coming years? Are things going to be better, worse, or about the same for you? Now, as you might expect, a sizable percentage of our respondents said it's too soon to tell. We just don't know, and that's certainly understandable. But again, we've got a little bit of a backslide over the past couple of years in terms of the optimism of organizations and what they think this year will hold. Now, because we've asked this question from year to year, we are able to compare. I mean, it's not exactly apples to apples because we might have different respondents from year to year, but we're able to track how well these predictions panned out. If 53% of our respondents thought things were going to get better last year, how many this year said that it had actually happened? So this is the chart that a colleague has dubbed the Metro chart, because it does kind of look like a subway map. But what this chart does is it compares actual versus predicted outcomes, circumstances for organizations over the last 10 years. And you'll see from 2008 to 2016, the green lines indicate those organizations that for whom circumstances had improved or had predicted circumstances were going to improve. The yellow indicates no change, and the red is those organizations who had predicted or actually for whom the situation had actually worsened. And you'll see, with the exception of 2009, which is a situation that nobody really could have predicted, the overall tracking, organizations are pretty good at predicting their circumstances. If the predictions in the solid lines were tracking upward, the actual circumstances, for the most part, also tracked upward. The predictions are in the dotted lines, and the solid lines are what actually happened. And what we see is, in the last couple of years, 2014, 2015, well, 2014, things were really getting better. 2015, organizations were a little more optimistic than actually were the case, and then the outlook is dipping again in 2016. So if you look at it in an overall trend kind of way, you see that there was a little bit of a peak a couple of years ago, and now people are getting a little bit more anxious as far as what's going to happen. A lot of uncertainty, which is why you see a gap between the predicted unchanged versus actual unchanged, but it's safe to say that those folks that were not sure what was going to happen, a good chunk of them actually, their circumstances didn't change from one year to the next. So I have spit out a bunch of different data at you, and the question, of course, more to the point, is why do we care? What does this mean, and why does this matter? Why are we even talking about this? And this goes back to something I said at the beginning of this session, which is New Jersey needs a strong nonprofit community. People rely on nonprofits for essential programs and services, for spiritual enrichment, for creativity, for coping, to help with distress. There are any number of services, and for affordable homes. There's no shortage, and we all know what nonprofits do and how nonprofits make lives better and save lives. We also talked about the economic impact of the work that nonprofits do. So it's not a real stretch to say that a strong nonprofit community is important to a strong New Jersey. And that's why if we've got organizations that are having their resources squeezed perpetually, this is an area of concern to us and a number of others. We have, as we were just talking about, a chronic gap between the growing demand for the services that nonprofits provide and the resources that aren't keeping pace. We've got government budgets that are uncertain at best. We've had a situation over the course of a number of years at this point where gradually the burden of providing services has been shifted from government to nonprofits, again without necessarily the resources commensurate to the need to provide those services. That's something, again, that has been taking place over many years. We've got increasing challenges to nonprofits' property tax exempt status and attempts to raise revenue on the backs of nonprofits by curtailing charitable giving incentives or other kinds of measures. We have some policymakers looking at nonprofits as a revenue source, or sometimes in the course of unrelated negotiations looking at them as a bargaining chip. And we've got a contracting framework that really isn't working, and this is something that the Center and others have been talking about for some years, but it all combines to exacerbate this situation where nonprofit resources are being squeezed when demand is going up. This picture is my representation, or Jenga's representation, of a stable, well-funded, strong nonprofit. It's a strong, high tower. It's solid. It's in good shape. It's a strong, sturdy kind of structure. Over the years, as we start to whittle away at nonprofit infrastructure support, as we start to make it harder for nonprofits to earn the revenue that they need, as we continue to skimp on infrastructure for nonprofits, you start to chip away at the structure. If you look at it at a certain angle, it may look pretty strong, it may look pretty decent, but over time you start to pull away at these essential supports and it takes its toll on organizations. And at some point or other, it's going to reach a breaking point where the structure can't survive. And we've seen reports of this. We've seen reports of Federation Employment Guidance Services, or FEGS, in New York, which was a large nonprofit organization that over many years, and due to a number of different factors, but including under-resourced contracts, collapsed and left a wake of unmet need, unemployment, and it was a huge, huge problem. And these kinds of risks are present in New Jersey as well. And this kind of situation applies not only to government-funded organizations. It applies across the board when we don't fund organizations adequately for them to be able to provide the services that they need. So what can we do? There are a lot of things that we can do, but I'm just going to offer a few. First things first, speak out. We can't remain silent in the face of these challenges to our ability to provide our services. This particular slide is very public policy focused, but public policy is not the only way that nonprofits should or can speak out about the problems and the challenges and the opportunities that they are experiencing. There is such a thing as everyday advocacy, which means you are speaking out in terms of the issues and the needs of your organizations and your constituencies in every forum that you can. Certainly in the public policy arena, during election season on a very careful, nonpartisan basis, to your funders, to the public, to the people that you serve, to your donors. Again, we have to raise our voices, and this is absolutely critical, especially now. And as we raise our voices, we need to do this from a position of strength. We need to be talking not with your hand out and your hat in hand, but from a position of, look folks, New Jersey needs a strong nonprofit community. New Jerseyans need the work that nonprofits do. And that's the common thread that all of us can use as we engage in advocacy in whichever form you want to think of it. Center for Nonprofits does a lot of this kind of work with our friends at the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers and others about dispelling myths about the nonprofit community. But the first myth is, this is that the nonprofit sector is an afterthought. The nonprofit community is not an afterthought, and we are essential to a good, thriving New Jersey, and it should all come from that. Use the data that's available in this report and elsewhere to tell that story, that combination of good data and good stories, which can be very compelling to people. Again, I've been hitting this theme a couple of times during this conversation, and that is fund the real costs of nonprofit work. The days in which we could continue to stretch, and nonprofits are a very creative bunch, and the work that nonprofits do in circumstances that are challenging at best is nothing short of remarkable. But there is a limit here, and if we continue to skimp at providing the funding that nonprofits need, there are consequences to that in terms of employee turnover and morale, in terms of capacity, and we need to continue to have that conversation. It's the good news is there are a lot of people paying attention to this in the funding community, in policy-making circles, and elsewhere, but we need to keep that message going. We need to strengthen nonprofit and government partnerships. Sometimes the partnership works better than others, to be sure. We need to make sure, just as we're talking about today, and just as we would with our donors, that government understands the realities of how nonprofits operate and what nonprofits need. We need to continue to work to address problems with the contracting system, to root out needlessly duplicative bureaucracy, because we don't have the time and we don't have the resources. We can provide and find efficiencies and increase our impact if we pursue a number of the reforms that have been advocated. It's all about communication, it's all about working jointly, and again, this is an oversimplification to be sure. Many, many organizations work very, very constructively and collaboratively with their partners in government, but sometimes the relationship is not as strong as it could be, and that's certainly a priority for us at the center. And government nonprofit partnerships is not strictly in a contracting situation, it's obviously with our partners in the State House and in policy-making circles and in DC and on the local level as well. We need to improve the fundraising and operating climate for nonprofits. These are just a couple of examples, making sure that the legislative climate works for us and enables nonprofits to more easily provide their missions. The threats to charitable giving incentives are very, very real. There have been a number of concerted advocacy efforts to try to make sure not only that charitable giving incentives are not eroded, but that perhaps we can strengthen them, because right now, as we all know, 75 to 80% of donated revenue comes from individuals. Individuals should be encouraged to give, and the consequences if charitable giving incentives are eroded will be pretty significant for nonprofits. So one way to help to ensure that nonprofits can do the work is to make sure that we've got a fundraising climate that makes sense. What else can we do? A lot of the things that nonprofits are already doing. Make sure we stay informed. Make sure we stay connected with other resources, with other advocates. The center will be publishing on our website very shortly a list of, it's kind of a high-level list of some of the lead organizations that are involved in advocacy and public policy within a number of specific fields. The center, for example, is not an affordable housing organization. We're not an environmental protection organization, although we have members and friends who pursue those missions and many, many others. But we want to help connect you to some of the organizations that are leading the charge on those issues, because we all know that in this climate it's impossible to keep up on everything, and this way advocates, would-be advocates, whether they be individuals or organizations, can help to connect with some of the folks that are the leading voices. So this will be a work in progress kind of list, but we will send you the link after the webinar, and welcome suggestions about who else should be on it. But it's a way to just make sure that people are making those connections and keeping connections. Support nonprofit advocacy, and that means from a funding standpoint, hopefully more funders will be willing to provide grants to organizations that provide that conduct advocacy. There are a lot of things that can be done without any reservation at all, and the center has a lot more information about that. Support real cost funding. Again, recognize that nonprofits have to invest in their own systems and infrastructure. Certainly on the nonprofit side, continue to do what you can to diversify revenue streams, because there's so much volatility right now. A diverse funding base clearly helps your organization to stay stronger. The need to invest in our own capacity, leadership development, infrastructure, is more important than ever. A lot of these things are not new, but it's just keep these conversations going, keep these good practices going. Collaboration, again, nonprofits sometimes get a little bit of a knock. They are not seen as collaborating, even though it's pretty much a standard in the nonprofit community, but it's going to remain even more important than ever to collaborate in new and creative ways. And of course, keep the dialogue going, both in terms of sharing news, sharing intelligence, sharing ideas, creative kinds of initiatives. You know, it all comes from communications and good relationships. We need to stand together as we move forward, because there's so much at stake in terms of creating a strong nonprofit community, in terms of creating policies that will enable the nonprofit community to do our work. This is not work that we do in a vacuum. That nonprofit work, by definition, is group work. And when we're looking at the implications of our surveys and our findings and what some of the challenges are that we're facing, this is not stuff that needs to be faced alone, and in many cases these are not challenges that should be faced alone. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention and suggest that you consider joining the Center for Nonprofits and supporting the kind of work that we do to track these trends and to advocate and be a voice for the nonprofit community and communicate to the media and our policymakers about what's going on and what nonprofits need. Membership is an investment in your organization, in New Jersey's nonprofit community, and you can also take advantage of a slew of important benefits as you go along. So if you're not a member of the center, we certainly hope that you will consider that. The annual survey report is, or will be very shortly, up on our website. The web address is on the slide. And it provides a lot more in the way of detail about other financial trends for nonprofits, other trends with respect to programs, good practices, what are the challenges that nonprofits are facing, and what are they doing about it. This briefing has been, by design, a little bit broad, but you have the chance to delve much more deeply into the questions that we have asked of the New Jersey nonprofit community. We hope that you will use this information in your own planning efforts, in your own advocacy efforts. Share them with your board, share them with your funders. We are happy to provide more detail, more context if you are interested. I hope also that you will stay in touch with us. There are a number of ways to do that. We have a very robust email list that you can sign up for. We are on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and we also have a blog. So if you're not connected with us, we certainly encourage you to do that and to tell us what you are experiencing. This only works if we are in communication with each other. So I do encourage you to stay in touch. Again, this is not the end of this conversation. This is a dialogue that is ongoing. Things are moving so quickly, both within the nonprofit community and in so many outer circles that affect what we do, that only through enhanced communication and keeping those lines of communication open are we going to be strong as we face the challenges and the opportunities that that are coming upon us. Can also encourage you to email us after the session, and we would be happy to get back to you about the implications of the survey or any other trend that you might be experiencing. We are here to work with you and to assist you, and we are going to be championing you, and we'll be alongside you every step of the way. This has been something of a quick dive, but I hope that you found this briefing valuable. We've only scratched the surface, and we welcome your involvement. So again, sign up for our email list, keep in touch, and connect with us on social media, and consider joining the center to support sessions like this one. I also want to remind you, hopefully this report did not stress you out too much, but if it did, remember we have 2 stress management trainings happening this week. So look at our website and look at the upcoming events. There's the webinar tomorrow with Beth Cantor, the national webinar, and then Wednesday we have a stress management workshop specifically for nonprofits here in New Jersey, presented by our chairperson, Yvette Murray. So let me end by thanking Sally Glick and her team at Sobel & Company for supporting this year's survey again, and for all the work they do on behalf of the nonprofit community. I'd like to thank everyone on this call for your patience and for your interest in these findings. Thank every nonprofit for all the work that you are doing, which is more important than ever. Thank you again for your time and your consideration, and we look forward to staying in touch.